All right. Welcome, everybody. I have a very special guest on my podcast today, Edward Pinto, who is a senior fellow and co director of American Enterprise Institute Housing Center. His focus is a role of federal housing policy in 2008 mortgage and financial crisis and how federal housing policy continues to create unwelcome distortions in the housing market, especially today. I follow Ed quite a bit. He writes in American Banker, The Hill, um, Real Clear Politics, and of course, the Wall Street Journal. I had a great pleasure of meeting Ed at the CEO roundtable next to White House in Washington, D.C. I was very, very impressed with all the analysis, and certainly you have a big fan here. And welcome to the podcast, Ed.
Thank you, Alex, and thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure.
Absolutely. Oh boy, I don't know where to start. Well, we can probably start with sort of overall um, housing appreciation, current markets. Where do you see U.S. housing today? And maybe let's touch on. I think you had a great view of housing pricing per tier, right? Low income to high income.
Right.
Yeah, let's touch on that. Let's start there.
Okay. And so one of the things we do at the Housing Center, we're all about data. I say we turn data into information, information into knowledge, knowledge into action. But you have to start with the data. And we go to great lengths to assemble the best, broadest, deepest data sources. And we combine those sources to the extent possible at the parcel level, street address level, and then we work up from there. And we get data from about 25 different providers, and we have a staff of 9 full time, and we basically work through the data, do our analysis, create new knowledge, and talk about how the market's doing and how we address issues. Either house prices are going up too quickly relative to incomes, or the supply is insufficient, or risk is growing. Whatever it might be, we use our data sources to analyze that. So you asked about house prices relative to price tiers, and we do a lot of work in that area. I'm going to get to that slide in a moment here.
Yeah.
And so one might ask, we have a house price appreciation index that we publish monthly. Why do we need another one? There's plenty of them out there. And the answer is a couple of fold. One is what you put your finger on, which is price tier. We're the only house price index that has 4 price tiers, but the price tiers are really based on leverage. And why is that? Well, what happens is that the federal government provides a lot of leverage, and that leverage, which we call uh, spiking the punch bowl, that leverage is targeted to first-time buyers or entry-level buyers. And we have 4 price tiers: low, low, medium, medium, high, and high. And the low and low medium are the entry-level price tiers. And you can see that since 2012, and if you went back with other data sources that divide things into 3 price tiers but aren't leverage based, you'll see that the lowest price tier historically goes up the most during a seller's market or boom area period, and collapses the furthest during a bust period. We've largely had only boom period since 2012. These dips and ups and downs that you're seeing are really largely seasonal. There's a lot of price change that occurs intra-year just because demand changes over the course of the year. Demand is usually the highest when families are looking for housing for their children to start school. And so the spring buying market is when demand is the strongest and prices are the highest during that in response to that demand. So you get a bit higher prices. And then over the holidays, December, January, prices tend to be the lowest. And so we're actually just seeing what's going on in the market. But you see this orange line on the left panel chart, which is the low price tier, has gone up 180% since we set it to zero back in 2012. So it's gone up almost 2 times in terms of house price appreciation. These are nominal appreciation, not inflation adjusted. Whereas the high price tier has gone up about 140%. So there's about a 40% extra increase that's occurred, percentage increase that's occurred for the low tier versus the high tier. That difference that you can see, the orange line versus the heavy blue line, has been going on since the beginning of the series, which dates to January 2012. As I said, that's normal during boom periods, and we've been in a seller's market or a relative boom period for this entire period. You can see, though, on the right panel chart where we show the same 4 price tiers, but now we're showing year over year by month. And you see that in the first 7 or 8 years, up until the early pandemic, the orange line was well above the blue line, which is why the orange line on the left side is well above the blue line. But then you see something that's very unusual that happens, which is during the pandemic, the blue line went up much faster than the orange line. They were all going up at a fast clip, 14%, which with the orange line was going up in 2022, is a very rapid increase, but it was nothing compared to the 23%, 24% that the high price tier was going up. Why was that? Well, earlier I mentioned about punch bowls. There are actually 2 punch bowls. There's the leverage punch bowl that Fannie and Freddie and FHA spike with their leverage. They really don't pay any attention to supply. They just look at how do they goose demand, and leverage gooses demand. It makes it easier to buy a house with the same amount, with a smaller down payment if you reduce the down payment, with the same amount of debt the same amount of income if you raise the debt ratio. It basically provides leverage. There's a second way that you can have a punch bowl, and that's what I call the monetary punch bowl. But everyone gets to drink from the monetary punch bowl. As I mentioned earlier, the leverage punch bowl is pretty much restricted these days, not in the run up to the financial crisis, but these days is pretty much restricted to first-time buyers. But the monetary punch bowl, everyone gets to drink from. And so you see when interest rates, and we'll go back a couple slides here and look at interest rates back in 2020, 2021, 2022, interest rates were below 3%. Everybody got low interest rates, not just first-time buyers, but high-end buyers also got it. And so the high-end buyers had a lot of stimulus that came from those low interest rates. And there was a lot of desire to move to homes that were in less dense areas, outside of large cities, larger homes with bigger yards because of the pandemic. And so you had a tremendous demand increase due to the pandemic that was enhanced by low interest rates. And we ended up with this huge price increase that occurred across the board, but it occurred the most in the high end of the market and to a somewhat lesser extent, but still robust in the low end of the market. You then see when interest rates were raised by the Fed after we had that huge bout of inflation, and the Fed finally woke up to the fact that it was creating massive inflation, in particular massive house price inflation, as we see here. We see that the blue line, the high end, drops to a little bit below zero. It drops to about zero, while the orange line, which is the low, stays at about 5%. It was still getting the leverage boost from the leverage punch bowl, but the monetary punch bowl had been withdrawn. And so we now see that the lines have all, on the far right and the the right panel chart, the lines are all pretty much converging on each other, and they're trending down. But the high price tier is still going up a bit more than the rest. It grew in the month of May by 3.7%, whereas the low went up by 2.3 percent year over year.
Just to interpret your slides for my audience, I love the phrase that you used. The first time home buyers are outside looking in. They still can't afford the home just because of that appreciation for the housing, right? Even though they might have credits. And I think we're going to touch on the new Trump presidency credits for the first time home buyers and helping there. The folks on the high income bracket, they don't care about the price. They are paying whatever the price is of the property in 2021, 2022, 2023. And now it looks like the high priced properties are now dropping based on your graph rates and are below the home appreciation index. Is that my interpretation accurate?
Well, I would say yes with a couple caveats. First of all, the high price tier is actually very careful. It's not getting leverage enhancement from the federal government.
Right.
It has to make the purchase on its own. And so up until the pandemic, it was actually the prices were lagging because while they had plenty of buying capacity, they weren't using all of that. It's their own buying capacity. They weren't using it all. Whereas the low price tier is basically just responding to leverage that's being provided by the government. And therefore, they're much more likely to get overextended. And we'll see some data on that in a minute, overextended. On the other hand, during the pandemic, money was cheap. You could borrow at under 3%. And at that point, you're right, then price wasn't so important. It was just, I need to get a house and I'm willing to pay anything to get it because the interest rate is so low and I have such capacity to borrow that's enhanced by these low interest rates that I'm going to drive the price up to where, it says here, the year over year rate peaked at about a plus 24%, which is unheard of. And now we're back to a more normal circumstance. And as I say here on this slide, the high price tier today has much less reliance on the leverage punch bowl combined with the ability to move down the price ladder. If you think of the housing market as a price ladder ordered by price in any market, if you're in the high price tier, you can move from, let's assume, a house for $1.3 million to a house for $1.1 million. If that $1.1 million house still meets your needs, you can move down by $200,000 and make up for somewhat higher interest rates. On the other hand, if you're in the low price tier, and that's at the $300,000 price range, where do you move down to? Maybe there aren't any houses at $225,000, in which case you have to drop out of the market and you're not able to provide that demand pressure because there just isn't a house for you. And so that's, again, how we look at the market. The market is really follows the laws of supply and demand. And it's really an auction market. It may not feel like an auction market, but anyone who's bought a house, it's put on the market and they take bids. And sometimes the houses sell quickly, sometimes they sell slowly, but it is fundamentally an auction market.
Perfect. So, Ed, so my actual question on this one is, I love your reference to sort of a buoyancy points or neutral points um, for the housing inventory, right? We talked about the affordability index, and that chart represents that. But you also define the supply and demands, right? To
Right.
quantify, do you expect the bid wars to actually happen today, or you see an oversupply, right? So I think somewhere during our meeting, you said there's about 6 to 8 months worth of supply is your neutral point. Can you explain what you mean by that and how
Sure.
it reflects right now?
Before I do that,
Yeah,
let's look at this slide quickly, which is year over year house price appreciation. We have a national mortgage market, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, FHA, et cetera. All real estate is local. Financing is national. Real estate is local. Prices are local. and you see vast differences in house price appreciation. The lowest house price appreciation is actually negative 10.3% year over year in Cape Coral, Florida. There was just an article in the Wall Street Journal about Cape Coral, Fort Myers. The fastest one is Louisville at 8.1% positive. That's an 18 percentage point swing between the slowest HPA market and the fastest. Yet the housing finance that's provided is the same in Louisville and Cape Coral. Namely, Fannie, Freddie, and FHA don't vary an iota depending on where you live. And so that leverage punch bowl is being provided everywhere, and it's having a bigger effect in Louisville than it is in Cape Coral. And we'll talk about that in a second. This is the HPA growth since the 2022 peak. And you see that there are a number of metros that have declined, led by Cape Coral, because Cape Coral had this 10% decline year over year. It's actually had a 13 roughly percent decline since its peak. Northport, Sarasota is number 2. Austin, Texas is number 3. San Francisco, Phoenix, and you see, and it turns out that if you go to the other side on the right side, you see that the Northeast and Midwest have experienced significantly more HPA growth. That's where you see Milwaukee is up 20% since its peak, 2022 peak. It's still up 20%, even though a place like Cape Coral is down 14%. Again, that's a huge swing that's occurring, that is happening independent of the financing, because the financing is the same everywhere. It's happening because there's a difference in supply and demand.
But what's the main cause, Ed? Is that the price appreciation in some of the more expensive areas, or that's the back to the office, or that's sort of um, people are coming back to their prior, residencies? I mean, what is the main cause, or there's a combination of them that causes those drops?
There's a combination that's going on. I'm trying to find the right chart here, and maybe it doesn't appear. So you have some, return to the office. That's not a huge factor. It's a factor, not a huge factor. The biggest factor is reversion to the mean. So if we look at these metros here, a year ago, San Francisco was a positive 5%. And if you go back further, it was a lot more than that. And now it's a minus 5%. Places that went up a lot during the pandemic really got ahead of their skis. And they got ahead of their skis again because the Fed was just providing free money. And so some markets went up a lot. Some markets went up just a fair amount, like Milwaukee. Milwaukee still went up a fair amount for Milwaukee, but it didn't go up anywhere near the amount that, say, Cape Coral or Austin or Boise went up. Boise, in those places, they were going up 25 to 30% year over year. And Milwaukee might have been going up only 15%. Well, again, so Milwaukee has less correction to go through. And so it still is relatively affordable compared to other markets. And Cape Coral has become relatively unaffordable relative to other markets. It's over its skis in terms of house price appreciation. And so now it's experiencing a year-over-year decline.
That makes sense. So what's the then relationship of, you're on the perfect slide. That was my question. Housing inventory, right? So if the homes keep dropping in price in some areas, I'm assuming that they are longer on the market for the sale, and then it counts towards the housing inventory and supply. And do you expect the continuous drop of those prices to sort of a calibration of what it was prior to pandemic, or it'll flatten out?
Well, we have a very long way to go to get for the pandemic. Again, if we go back here, notice the low end was up, the high part of the market, the blue, in the beginning of the pandemic was up 50%.
Yeah.
It ended up being up 140%. So there's a huge boost that occurred right in this area right here due to interest rates being at 3%. The low end of the market in the beginning of 2020 was at 81%, and now it's at 172. There's 90 percentage points that has occurred since the beginning of the pandemic. To get rid of much of that, if you just were to take this line and continue it along the trend that it had been going, you might be here. So nationwide, you'd have to be looking at going from 180 to maybe 140, which would be about a 20% decline. I don't think we're going to see a 20 percentage point decline in the market nationally. During the great financial crisis, we had about a 25% decline. Likewise, we had some markets like Los Angeles, Las Vegas, Cape Coral that had 50% declines, cumulative. I don't think we're going to see 50% declines, but can Cape Coral see a 20% decline? Yes. 20% is pretty strong, but it's nowhere near the 50% decline it experienced in the run-up to the great financial crisis. And that's largely going to be because mortgage risk, the overall level of leverage in the system is a lot less than it was in 2006, 2007, at the end of the great run-up in loose lending that was going on, number one. And there was a lot of very odd lending that went on. We no longer have liar loans and other things like that. So that has led to, a tightening of mortgage credit. Having said that, the Fed, in effect, with its 3% interest rates, was the equivalent of really loosening credit. They made it. It doesn't make any difference if your income is X and you can raise the debt to income ratio or have a liar loan and then afford a home that sells for $400,000 with your income of, say, $100,000. If they lower the interest rates and you can afford with rigorous credit, you can still afford a $400,000 home, but then interest rates go from 3% to 7%. That's the same as taking away the leverage punch bowl, but in this case, they've taken away the monetary punch bowl.
It sounds like you really have to push the Feds to lower the interest rates again, to spike up the housing market again, to see more activity, or
We don't want the Fed doing distortionary actions, which is what they historically have done.
yeah,
The Fed shouldn't be micromanaging. And so what the real error of the Fed was, they did quantitative easing. And quantitative easing basically said, we're going to buy mortgage-backed securities issued by Fannie, Freddie, and Ginnie, and we're going to use that to drive down the long end of the market, 10-year end of the market. And in doing so, we're going to drive interest rates down. And they did, and it worked tremendously well. They had to buy trillions and trillions of dollars of mortgage-backed securities. And they also bought trillions of dollars of treasury securities. But they bought way too many, and they still have trillions. And they have a loss of close to $1 trillion on their investments because those investments are no longer worth near anything what they paid for them. Well, the problem is that has created all kinds of distortions in the housing market. Not only did it drive up house prices tremendously, as we've seen, but it also has led to freezing people in place. If you have a 3% mortgage and the current rates are 7%, then you're going to stay put, and you're not going to sell your house. You're not going to move up. And so that has created a shortage of inventory. So here are the inventory numbers. And you can see in 2024, we started with inventory that was around 1 million back in January of 24, and then it grew over time, eventually got to 1.4 million, but that 1.4 million was nowhere near what it was in 2018 and 2019, which are the gray and orange lines at the top. We consider that to be, those are the last 2 normal years before the pandemic. So now we're going to switch to the black line, which is 2025. And we see 2025 started out with inventory higher than it was in 2024, but still way below 2018 and 19. It's been growing, and it's been narrowing that gap between 2018 and 19 and 2025. And the latest data that we have from last week shows that that gap has narrowed a bit more. You mentioned about what is the sort of equilibrium spot. We did a study of historical data, and we found that the equilibrium spot, the natural nominal price equilibrium or neutral point, is at 6 to 8 months supply. At that point, prices are not, nominal prices are basically going up zero, give or take. And but you're hardly ever at the equilibrium point. You're either passing through it on the way up or you're passing through it on the way down. But we know there is this concept of an equilibrium point.
Are we close to it now?
Excuse me?
Are we close to equilibrium now, or near?
So as of May, we were at 3.7 months, which is still a pretty strong seller's market. So there are some markets, and again, we saw them, the ones that are appreciating rapidly, those have very low supply, and the ones that are declining have higher supply. There's another chart, it's not in this pack, that shows that relationship, and it's a very strong relationship. As the month supply increases, house price appreciation, metro by metro, slows until eventually, if your supply gets well above this equilibrium point, you're going to start having negative house price appreciation year over year. So that's what we track.
Yeah. So let me just ask an additional question. I read your article in the Hill about the California being epicenter of the shortage of houses, and your prediction is you're missing about 6 million homes. Can you comment on that, and how does it play into this picture?
So we've had a growing housing shortage. We've had a housing shortage for a long time. It ebbs and flows, but we've had a housing shortage for a long time. Trying to calculate exactly what that housing shortage is not easy, because there's lots of ways of doing it, and so what we did was we looked at 4 or 5 studies, each of which came up with an estimate, and then we took the midpoint of those estimates. And we said, well, the midpoint's around 6 million. We don't know whether the right answer is 4 million or 8 million, but let's assume 6 million. We do know that you can distribute that shortage of 6 million state by state and actually municipality by municipality through a relatively simple metric, which is median house price to median income. There's a lot of research that shows, going back a very long time, that says when you have a median house price to median income of 3 or less, so house prices are less than 3 times median income, that houses are affordable when it's 3 or less. You get above 3 and houses get less and less affordable. California is up at 8 times income. San Francisco's up at 10 or 11. LA's up at 10 or 11. And it turns out, and this will tie into this sale of federal lands, which we might have time to talk about also, but the western third of the country has the most unaffordable housing measured by this metric of median house price to median income. Why? It's what I have dubbed the California effect. California has had bad housing supply policies for decades and decades and decades, going back to the mid-1970s. Before then, California had normal prices. its median house price income was about 3, like the rest of the country. The rest of the country might have been 2.8. It was a little bit higher. Even San Francisco was just somewhat above 3. But that all started changing in the mid 70s. It's just gotten worse and worse. And so you've had a massive outmigration from California. We call it a domestic outmigration. So population can grow or decline 3 ways. You have international migration, you have domestic migration, and you have natural births versus deaths. Those are the 3 ways you can change population. California has had international migration to a fair extent. It has had increasing deaths versus births to the point where those finally flipped and it had more deaths than births. And it has had for 35 years massive domestic outmigration, mostly to the western third of the country. We can actually show where that outmigration goes. It's the western third of the country. If you throw in Austin, Texas, you've pretty much described everything that happens. So what happens? People leave Texas with a bag of money. They get a very large amount when they sell their house, if they own a house, or they're paying very high rents. They move to Austin, Texas, or they move to Boise, Idaho. They can buy nearly 3 homes for the same price of the home they sold in San Francisco. We actually have data to show that. And therefore, when they get to when they get to Austin or they get to Boise, and they just can bid up the price of houses because to them it's rounding.
Yeah.
They've just won the lottery. And they bring higher income with them. We can also document that. So you now have people with a lot of financial wherewithal in terms of equity that they brought from what they sold, and they have higher incomes, and they start competing with the people in Boise. And so Boise during the pandemic period had 30% year-over-year house price appreciation. This went on for a couple of years. And now Boise is on the reverse side of that, as is Austin.
Yeah, same thing is New York and Florida, right?
Yeah.
Connecticut, Jersey, New York.
Second biggest out-migration state. How much out-migration has California had since 1990, cumulatively? Net domestic out-migration, 4.5 million individuals, as reported by the IRS. New York's had maybe 3 million. Where I've already talked about where the Californians go, and where do they have the biggest impact? Las Vegas and Nevada. Why? Nevada has the longest border with California. It's the closest to California, and it's a relatively small state compared to California. Texas is further away, but it's a very large population state, and the biggest impact has been concentrated largely on Austin because a lot of people move to Austin. Now, what happens in New York? New York moves to 2 places, New Jersey and Florida. Largely Florida, followed by New Jersey. And then there's a bunch of other places, but those are the big 2. And so it has an impact, particularly on Florida. And so it's driven up house prices throughout migration in Florida, and California has driven up house prices in these other 10 Western states. And so that has led to a housing shortage because we haven't been able to keep up with demand. How do we know that? Well, if house prices are going up 5% a year and wages are going up 3% a year, supply and demand tells us we're not creating enough supply to meet demand. It's as simple as that. And we could. The only reason we're not, it's not because builders don't want to build. It's because governments won't let the housing being built. Let me just describe it very simply. Cars are built, in 100 factories around the country. Computers are built wherever, whatever. Food is grown, whatever. When it comes to housing, there are 3,000 zoning districts in the United States. Each one of those zoning districts makes their own decision about whether you're going to build housing or not. And they generally say no. So you have 3,000 people saying, not in my backyard. And the result is 3,000 jurisdictions saying, not in my backyard. The result is you end up with a housing shortage. Not because the private sector can't build, but it's illegal to build, particularly at the price points that people can afford. And so we end up with the 6 million, and then we distribute that 6 million state by state, locality by locality, based on this relationship to median house price to median income. We then, Alex, concluded that over 2 million, I forget the exact number, it's 2 point, I forget what number, of that 6 million is attributable directly to California and the other states in its blast zone. And so that's why California is largely responsible for much is responsible for much of the housing shortage that we have.
That's a great explanation, Ed. And that's a great lead into the topic that I think you wanted to discuss as well. So with the migration to Nevada and other areas and the shortage of permits, I guess, to build the properties, I think you have a letter to the White House that I noticed you sent to the current president and the White House staff to allow building permits on the federal land, right?
Yep.
Especially in Nevada. I think I saw one of your maps showing how much land is owned by the federal governments, and that's bounding some of the developments in Nevada. It's smack in the middle and prevents people from building. Can you summarize your letter to
Yeah.
the
So
presidency? Yeah.
um, a colleague here, Arthur Gales, and I had an op-ed in last week's Wall Street Journal on this topic. The president could authorize the sale of land to build 1 million homes out west, and that would, be a good start on trying to address the shortfall out west, where it's the most severe. It just so happens this land is out west. There isn't any Bureau of Land Management land east of a line that runs from New Mexico to Colorado, Wyoming, Montana. You go east of that line, the square footage, the number of acres rounds to zero. This is left over from westward expansion. And we've identified where the housing could be built. And you mentioned Las Vegas. When we look at a map of Las Vegas and we look at federal ownership, not just BLM, but Forest Service and military and you name it, 97% of Las Vegas is hemmed in by government land. So there's Las Vegas Valley, which is where people live, but then there's all this land around it. 97% of all of that circumference around it is owned by the federal government. So Las Vegas has nowhere to grow, yet it's growing economically. People move there all the time. It's a very rapidly growing place, yet there isn't enough land to build on. And threfore prices go up and up and up. Las Vegas and Reno, if we go back and look at our house price appreciation, the three fastest growing metros in the country, the top 60, were Las Vegas, Reno, and Boise. All of those are the center of the California blast zone, and they're all greatly constrained by federal land.
Who do you sell it to? I mean, do you sell it to the builders? Do
You sell it
you
to the
have
builders,
Okay.
and you sell it to the builders at market rate, and you let them build on it, hopefully at some modestly increased densities that allow the price. One thing we know is cities love to have expensive housing built. Again, that they make large lots. They have big houses. It's not because builders want to build large houses. It's because that's the only thing that's legal that can be built. We have all kinds of research that shows if given the choice, builders will build small houses on small lots. And the optimum is to build townhomes on small lots. But townhomes are illegal almost everywhere. I was down in Memphis. Up until a year or two ago, they were illegal in all residential areas. They just were illegal. They used to be normal. It was normal to build townhomes in the 1920s. That was all made illegal. And townhomes are, among all the different types of housing you could build for owner occupancy, are the least expensive. Condos are even less expensive, but condos run into a lot of condo liability laws. So we're going to put that off to the side. When you're talking about sales of fee simple sales of a property on a lot, you've only got two types, basically. You got single family detached and you got single family attached. Single family attached sell for a lot lower price than single family detached. Why? The lots are smaller. If you have a smaller lot, you have smaller gross living area, and it's less expensive to build a townhome. Townhomes have fewer outside walls.
Sure.
They butt up against the home next door. They have a simpler design. They have fewer windows. All of those reduce the cost of building per square foot, along with less land and less square footage in total. You put all that together, and townhomes can be $100,000 or $200,000 less than a single family attached home, and certainly $100,000 less than a similar um, um, sized, in terms of gross living area, single family detached home of a similar size. So you get a big savings when you allow the market to build what is, in fact, the highest and best use of that land.
Plus, federal government will certainly benefit from a few $1 billion worth of, sales money to cover.
Absolutely. It can be more than a few billion. We think it could be 10 to 20 billion, which again, in the scheme of the federal government is rounding, but I still think of that as real money.
Yeah, and just one more comment. My firm was a part of the Trump One wall project in the border of Mexico, and we did the research. Believe it or not, a lot of the land owned right in the border of Mexico is the federally owned land. Big, huge pieces that certainly can be also considered for a build out. I'm sure that there's some corridor for the border agents to monitor
Right.
the activity, but certainly the acreage of the border federally owned
There is
land.
no BLM land to speak of in Texas, number one. There is BLM land in New Mexico, um, Arizona, and California. However, um, the 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 land that probably is Las Cruces, Mexico, which is a part of the El Paso metro. So there's no BLM land in Texas, but there is BLM land in Las Cruces, New Mexico, and that's near the border. And there's plenty of demand there, and this would be ideal. There's plenty of land around Las Vegas. There's plenty of land, near Phoenix. There's lots of land. We've identified where the land's located, where the demand is sufficient, the growth is sufficient. Remember, there's already a shortage, and so part of this goes to meet the shortage. Part of it goes to meet future needs. But there's areas of the country that out west that there's a lot of land, but they don't have enough demand. And so there's no point in trying to build on land where there isn't enough demand for that housing. You don't want to just build housing for the sake of building housing. You have to build housing where there's economic growth and demand.
Yep. So building to satisfy the supply, satisfy the affordability, satisfy the federal government funding with the sale of the land. That's part one. Part two, I read the recent article that you put out. I think you were in support of this big beautiful bill and what it means for the housing market. I think one thing that you focused on was the low income housing tax credits that should stimulate the build out for the lower bracket, as you point out on your chart. But still, I didn't see that the money was big enough. It was only 14 billion, I believe. Um,
Well, let me push back on that because we actually had an op-ed in The Hill last week, basically pushing back completely and totally on low-income housing tax credits. I got my start in my housing career. I've been in housing for 52 years, and I got a start at the Michigan State Housing Development Authority. I'm an attorney by training, and I was general counsel there for many years. So I'm very familiar with affordable housing. Um, I'm not a supporter of low-income housing tax credit for 5 reasons. I call them the 5 C's. Costly. Low-income housing tax credit units, apartments cost twice as much as what the private sector would charge for the same unit, number one. Number two, complexity. The regulations are, stacks and stacks of regulations, which means you have to have a lot of overhead and a lot of staff in order to do this. Small players can't participate in that market. which will come back. I'll talk about that as the fifth C. Third is corruption. You just Google corruption and low-income housing tax credit, and you'll see dozens and dozens of articles. NPR has done stuff. There's all kinds of articles about corruption. It's just a honeypot of corruption. And affordable housing, subsidized housing, been that way for decades. It was that way when I was at Michigan Housing. We went to great strides to eliminate that corruption, but at the federal level, the corruption was rampant at HUD back in the 70s. That's number 3, corruption. Number 4, crowding out. It's easy to say, oh, it's going to add another, I forget the number they were using, 100,000 units. Well, that's just a made-up number. It's what they're, quote, going to finance, but it misses 2 things. Number 1, about half of the low-income housing tax credit units are rehabilitation of existing units. It's not an additional unit.
So it doesn't matter for housing, yeah.
Or it's a tear down of a public housing unit, and they're going to recycle the land for LIHTC. That's not adding additional units either. And so when I'm talking about adding 1 million units, or we have a shortage of 6 million, I'm not bootstrapping it by counting the units that are already there. And that's what this LIHTC program does when it says, oh, we're going to add 100,000 homes. But the next thing is it crowds out the private sector. I can speak personally to that. I tried to do a development in Sarasota, Florida. I mentioned Northport, Sarasota, Florida. I eventually was looking in Manatee County, which is the northern county in the Sarasota metro area, in Bradenton. And I was going to do a 200 apartment development, and it was going to cost $100,000 per door. And at the time, LIHTC was costing $225,000 a door. My units were smaller, but so what? There were a lot. Their actual rents that I was going to charge were going to be a lot less than their market rents. And I went to the city. I found 2 parcels that the city owned, and I went to them to try to buy those parcels to build this development. And they said, Ed, you don't understand. We've been offered $4 million for that parcel. I said, well, I can only afford to pay you $2 million. I said, but the LIHTC development's getting tens of millions of dollars of subsidies. He said, Ed, you don't understand. We don't care about that. Those money's coming from the federal government. All we care about is how much goes into our coffers when we sell the land. And so I had to abandon. I got crowded out, and that happens all the time. There's research that shows that crowding out is almost 1-for-1. And so there really isn't any increase. And these programs have 2 other, problems. One is, I mentioned they're, costly. Another little sort of hidden item is that about half of the units get monthly rent subsidies. So in addition to all the upfront subsidies that, as you know, the capital stack, that could be 5, 6, 7, 8 different subsidy sources. In addition to LIHTC, they also have monthly stipends to the people to pay the rent, because the rents are still very high.
Sure.
And so, but the federal government pays 90% of that 50%. So there's a never-ending call on the federal government for this housing. So that's another problem. So I'm not in favor of that program. As far as I just had an interview earlier today, as far as the One Big Beautiful Bill, I think the biggest opportunity is the increase in economic growth. I do believe it will lead to increase in economic growth. I know that the Congressional Budget Office says it's going to be 1.8%. I believe it's going to be something over 3%. Why do I believe that? Well, I believe that that's what happened the first time. People don't remember what the growth was. It was very sluggish coming out of Obama's second term. And the market in 18 and 19, the GDP was ignited. Now, things all changed with the pandemic. You have to put that off to the side. But in 18 and 19, there was a huge boost. And it led to wage increases for the bottom third of the market, the wage earner part of the market. That really benefited. And you remember the stories that said, Black unemployment, the lowest rate in history. Black wages are going up more than middle wages. Hispanic wages are going up more. These were routine stories that appeared in 2018 and 2019 because that bill was a rising tide that not only raised all ships, it raised certain ships even higher, and those were the working class ships. I think that's going to happen here.
Yeah, and in my own opinion, I do see already a lot of manufacturers are bringing and building the plants here. They'll need the workers at the plants on top of the establishing the plants and manufacturing in opportunity zones for tax bonus depreciation. In addition to the extra tariffs when you import things versus manufacture things, we see already talking to the business owners, CEOs, folks that are selling products into US, that shift, and it's very significant. Folks that used to do a sale of medical equipments by manufacturing in China and bringing it in the US due to tariffs now planning to build a huge warehouses, huge manufacturing facilities, bringing jobs into some of the low income areas, boosting that low income bracket or low income.
The issue is going to be housing. They just don't have enough housing. I was just in Savannah. Savannah's a boom town. It's got one of the largest ports in the country. We were staying at the Hyatt Regency on the Savannah River downtown, and the ships were going up and down loaded with containers. I've been there before. To me, I didn't see any, again, this is anecdotal. I didn't see any impact of the tariffs. The ships were going up and down like there was no tomorrow, loaded with containers. However, there aren't sufficient places, and there's factories going in all the time, Hyundai, Kia, you name it, but there isn't enough housing because the local communities refuse to allow the housing to be built. They won't unleash the private sector. We need to unleash the private sector.
Yeah, I agree. And, I spoke with the Chris Whalen, our mutual
Yes.
acquaintance, and we do agree that HUD is sitting on tons of inventory. They have to let it go. I would estimate their burn rates about $2 billion a year of reverse mortgages that they have to sell through the auctions, and they're just slowly sipping them through.
Everything happens slowly at HUD.
Well, hopefully with the new administration, it'll speed up.
Yes, it's difficult because of the entrenched bureaucracy.
Agreed. But at the same time, I sense that, we will see a short term pain, sluggish growth, and then it'll certainly change based on some of the regulations that are changing in the current Trump presidency. So just in the few minutes that we have left.
I've only got one more minute.
Yeah. So anything, how can people find you? At any final words?
If you just Google AEI Housing Center, you'll get to various websites. We have something called HEAT, Housing and Economic Analysis Toolkit. If you just AEI HEAT, you'll find that. If you Google me, you'll find all of my work. I'm easy to reach and easy to find.
Hopefully, we'll see each other in September at the next version of
Yes,
Year
looking
Round
forward
Table.
to that. I know the plan's already in the works.
Yeah, I'll definitely be sponsoring that one. Ed, thanks so much. Pleasure.
Okay, Alex.
Take
Pleasure.
care.
Thank you.
Yep.